When I first started renting my first house in my late 20s, I wish I had changed the locks myself. But the landlord swore that he changed the locks after evicting the last tenant, so I figured I could save some money. Plus, the excitement of moving into a new house overtook me once I had the keys, so as soon as I unpacked, I pretty much forgot about any problems that I had with the house. The first thing that I did was started to take measurements of the basement because I planned to remodel it, but that would result in the first time that I was uncomfortable in my own home. As I was taking measurements of the specific corner where I planned on putting a standing bar, I noticed that there was a part of the wall that seemed to be more freshly plastered than the rest. I don't know what compelled me to poke it, but I did, and my finger pressed through the plaster like it was nothing. I pulled at that section of the wall and it came off as easily as wallpaper, revealing a small hole with a book inside. I opened up the small book and was immediately confused by what I was looking at. It was a handwritten journal of sorts, but it was written in a language that I didn't understand or recognize. I brought the journal back upstairs with me and kept looking through it, wondering if I would find anything worth looking at. But it was all written in that weird language, so I just set it down on the table. That night I went to sleep pretty early, but was woken up around midnight by a strange noise. I sat up from my bed and listened for the sound again, and I didn't have to wait long. I could hear what sounded like someone pacing back and forth right outside my bedroom window. I jumped out of my bed and quickly turned the light on before turning back toward the window. I listened again before walking toward it, but this time I couldn't hear anything. I pulled back the curtains and looked outside, but I didn't see anything out there. That didn't make the intense feeling go away though. I couldn't get back to sleep for the rest of the night, and the first thing I did the next day was go to the store to pick up a few cameras to place around my house just in case that happened again. It took me most of the day to set them all up, but I made sure to have 2 outside facing each side of the house, and then just for good measure, I put one in the living room and my bedroom as well. That night I went to sleep a little easier, knowing that I had cameras to alert me if someone stopped by. But that sense of safety went away when I woke up to a phone notification. I looked at my phone and my eyes widened as I saw that the living room camera had been triggered. I unlocked my phone and had to stifle a scream as I looked through the phone and saw a man standing right in the center of my living room. But what really scared me was the fact that he seemed to be looking right at the camera. It was as if he watched me install it and knew right where I would be watching him from. My heart pounded in my chest as the man slowly turned around and started walking in the direction of my bedroom. I looked over to the door and feared for my life as I tried to figure out what to do. And as I heard the sound of footsteps getting closer, I did the only thing I could think of. I leaped across the room and locked the door to stall the man for a second as I ran over to the window and opened it. I could hear him open the door handle as I popped the screen out, and just as I managed to climb through the window, I heard the sound of the door busting open behind me. I fell out of the window and ran through my yard and into the road without looking behind me. I had my phone in my hand the whole time and managed to call the police, who told me to wait in a nearby safe area until they arrived. I kept running until I saw a small patch of trees for me to run into. I stuck myself behind a tree and then pulled up the camera that was in my bedroom to see if the man had left my house yet. And to my horror, he was still there. Once again, he was looking right at the camera as if he knew I would be watching him, only this time, I could see something in his hand. It was the journal that I had found on my first night in the house. After a minute or so passed, through the camera I could see the police lights flashing outside, and the man quickly made a run for it. He left through the window just like I did, and I ended up returning home once I knew the police had secured the place. They couldn't find any sign of the man other than the recordings that I had of him from the app, but beyond that, there was nothing. I ended up breaking my lease agreement and moving out by the end of the month after I found a different place to rent that felt safer to me. One of the selling points when I moved my family into our new house was the treehouse in the back end of the yard for my son to play in. And I was happy to see that within our first few hours of being in the house, he was loving it out there. I hadn't seen him happier in quite some time, and for the next couple of weeks, it was like he was spending as much time as he could out there. He was always bringing snacks and comic books with him out there, but told me and my wife that we couldn't go with him because it was a secret base. It was sweet, or so we thought. Everything changed when weird things started happening around the house. The first thing that I can remember was being woken up in the middle of the night. Both my wife and I thought we heard something in the kitchen, and as I was getting out of bed to see what it was, we both heard the sound of the sliding glass door closing. Despite the fear of someone being in the house, I knew that I needed to protect my family and rushed out of the room to see who was inside. But when I got into the kitchen, there was no one in sight. I ran over to the sliding door and turned the light in the backyard on and looked out to see if I saw anything, but the yard seemed empty. I did a quick walk through the house and made sure everything was locked up tight before going back to sleep. The next day, everything started out normal, until I went to make lunch and noticed that a few of the things that we bought from the store were missing. I asked my son if he knew where the chips had gone, and he said that Brandon must have taken them. I asked him who Brandon was, and that's when he said it was his friend who lived nearby. I was confused because he hadn't started school yet, so he couldn't have met anyone. So I just figured that he had an imaginary friend he was playing with, and maybe he took the chips but didn't want to say anything. I brushed it off as nothing. But then a few nights later, we were woken up by that same sound. The kitchen door was sliding open and then closed. I jumped out of bed and ran right for the kitchen, but again, there was nothing. This time though, I noticed that the sliding door hadn't been closed all the way. I ran over to the door and looked out into the yard, and this time, it wasn't empty. I almost fell backward as I turned the light on and saw a man in a cheap-looking mask standing at the sliding door with a knife in his hand. I screamed as I slammed the door closed. The man reached out and tried to open it, but I used all my strength to keep it closed as I called for my wife to get our son and call the police. I managed to lock the door, but saw that he wasn't going to stop there. He started using the handle of the knife by slamming it against the glass of the door. He was trying to break through. I turned and ran as fast as I could to the bedroom that my family was in and slammed the door shut behind me before pushing the dresser and our bedside table in front of the door. My wife was on the phone with the police, and I asked my son if he was all right, and that was when he said something that shook me to my core. He asked me why I was so scared, and then he said, "It's just Brandon." I took a second and then asked him what he meant by that. And that was when he said that his friend Brandon told him to leave the door unlocked because he was going to visit and leave us presents that night. I thought about it for a second and then asked him if Brandon had ever asked him to do that before. And that was when my son said that he did it on the night that some of our food had gone missing. I asked him where Brandon lived, and that was what he told me was horrifying. He only said 2 words: my treehouse. I looked over to his mom and we both looked at each other with horrified looks on our faces. But before we could say anything, we both turned our attention to the door. We could hear the sound of the masked man's knife scraping along the wall as he walked down the hallway toward our bedroom. And then it stopped after he got outside of it. We all began screaming as he started throwing himself on the door trying to break through. Thankfully, the dresser didn't budge at all, and after a minute of trying, the slamming stopped. The police showed up shortly after and searched the house for the man who had broken in, but they couldn't find him. We had them check the treehouse, and they said that they found signs of someone living there, but no clear sign of where they went. That night we stayed at the motel in town while we figured things out. Then we ended up moving back in with my parents until we found a new house that was within our budget. This one wouldn't have a treehouse. It was my first night in my new house when I was interrupted during a game of online poker. I overheard something strange through my headphones that made me take them off. Suddenly, there was this loud screaming that sounded like it was coming from outside. I looked around for a minute to make sure that I wasn't going crazy, but when I heard the scream again, I quickly went over to the window to check it out. I couldn't see anything through the darkness, but I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs every few minutes. I assumed that someone had called the cops when the screaming finally stopped after almost an hour. I went to bed that night not thinking anything of it, and by the next evening, I forgot about the whole thing. That is, until I heard it again. This time I was watching some TV when I heard the same exact screaming noise that I had heard the night before, only this time, it was much closer. I went over to the same window I had checked the last time I heard the screaming, and this time, I could see it. Clear as day, there was a man who looked to be about 65 or 70 years old, standing at the edge of my lawn just screaming in the direction of my house. I watched him for a few minutes to see what he was doing, but it didn't seem like he was really doing anything other than screaming. It wasn't even like he was looking at my house. It was like he was staring out into space as he screamed. I started to get really uncomfortable and ended up calling the police, and when they arrived, I could see them approach the man as I watched from the window. I couldn't hear what they said to him, but I saw that the man must have known where I was watching him from because he pointed right at the window I was looking through. After a minute of talking with the man, the police officers came up to the door. I asked them what happened, but all they could say was that he didn't seem like he was all there. They said that he seemed like he was under the influence of something and they couldn't really understand what he was saying. All they could make out was when he pointed to my house. Apparently, when he did that, all the police could understand him saying was, "There's something wrong about the man in that house." I explained to the officers that I had just moved in and had never seen that man before in my life, so I didn't know what he could have meant. After talking with them for a few more minutes, the officers simply suggested that he go home, which he said he would do. And they told me to call them again if he came out, and I thanked them before locking my door and trying to get some sleep. The next day, I hoped that I wouldn't hear that screaming again, but sadly I was wrong. And like clockwork, around the same exact time as the 2 nights before, I heard the sound of that man screaming. This time when I looked out of my window, he was standing right in my yard, and I didn't hesitate to call the police. The same officers arrived as the night before, and this time they didn't take any chances. They arrested the man for trespassing, and according to the reports, he ended up being diagnosed with dementia. And since he didn't have any caretakers, he was placed in a state-run home where he could be monitored and taken care of. To this day, I don't know what drew him to my house. I'm just glad that it isn't happening anymore and hope he got the help that he needed.